This is Groundeffected. My name is Brent, and welcome to Knocking Over Your Paint Water again. Now, I've done videos in the past going over how I paint skin tones on certain characters. I've done light skin tones and I've done dark skin tones. If you were interested in those videos, you can check the playlist. And on those videos, I had a couple comments from some people who either couldn't get the skin tone sets or they couldn't get model paints completely in the country that they're in. And so this gave me an idea. When I was walking through the art store the other day, I saw some super cheap craft paints and I bought just the primaries. Now on the shelf there was loads of colors. I could probably have built an entire palette out of these paints. So there is definitely an option. If you have a local art store, you can probably find some kind of craft paint and you could probably make this work. Now I thought if I'm going to challenge myself to using cheap craft paints, I might as well take that challenge one step further, and instead of just buying any color, I only bought 3 primaries, a black and a white. This gives me 5 colors total, and the reason that I've chosen these colors is because from these 5 colors I can make any color that I need in order to paint the model that I want. Yes, this will require some knowledge of color theory. However, it's pretty simple. If you've been to primary school, you can probably figure out how to make most colors, and you just need to apply a bit of knowledge into how those colors interact with each other so that you can make the most out of the colors that you're able to get your hands on. Before we get into the video, make sure to leave a like, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing, because for every new subscriber that I get, I will have one more new subscriber. Now without any further ado, let's just see what these paints can do, shall we? Like I said, I was walking through the art store the other day and I saw these paints which were on sale for only £1 each, and this instantly sparked a memory in my brain, which reminded me that somebody had mentioned they didn't have access to model paints and wanted to know how I would go about approaching a model with just craft paints or any cheap paint from the store. Now, in order to keep this thing as cheap and all bought from the store as possible, I did not use any model purposed products. So for the base coat on the model, I'm going to prime it with a black spray paint, and I'm going to use a white spray paint to give it a zenithal and a slight volumetric highlight. Nothing too crazy, but I do want to make the model quite light because this is obviously going to help, especially if the coverage of these cheaper paints is not as good as I want it to be. So starting from white will give me a stronger base for the saturation of the colors. In order to mix up a skin tone, I'm going to mix a bit of red, yellow and white, and this is going to make an orange color. I am going to try and make it a little bit more darker because I am painting Storm's face, so I want it to look a lot darker than the average peach colored person. I placed the mix that I had made into my airbrush and I mixed in a fair amount of water to make sure that it would flow super easy. I started out by adding super thin layers to the model's face. After the first layer, you can already see the work that my zenithal highlight is doing for me. This is one of the easiest ways that you can save some time if your paints aren't covering very well. I needed to give about 3 or 4 layers of this paint that I had mixed up to give a decent, solid color for the base tone of the face. Once that had fully dried, I made sure to seal this all in with a matte lacquer. This is just a spray paint you can find at your hardware store or an art store as well. I then used a little bit of oil paints. Now if you can't find washes in the country that you're in, you'll probably be able to find oil paints, and this is going to be the next best way for you to make a decent wash that's going to work really well. I place a little bit of the paint into a spare holder on my palette, and then I take a load of white spirit and pour it into another spare holder, and I slowly mix the oil into that spirit until it becomes nice and viscous and flows really well. I'm going to use this wash to go into all the crevices around the model. This is going to create a little bit of depth in those crevices for me. In order to seal this in and to be able to paint over the top of that with a little bit more ease, I'm going to use an acrylic medium. This usually can also be bought at the art store. By using the acrylic matte medium, this is going to help the paint go on top of it a lot easier than the clear lacquer that I originally used, because that lacquer has a smoother texture and it doesn't hold the next layers very well. So in order to make it stick a bit better, I used the matte medium just to create a bit more small spaces for the paints to hold on to on the surface of the model. I then mixed up something very similar to my Grimoire Purple, and basically this is going to be a purple that I'm going to use. It starts out a little bit redder than I would expect, and because of this I did decide to come back in and add a little bit more blue to it. Once I had done a couple of layers of the red though, I allowed that to dry and added a bit of the blue in just to create a bit more of a purple tone, and this helps to create more life in the skin. Skin tones, as I've said many times before, are not something made of one or two colors. It is multiple colors, and it is the layering of these colors that will sell the effect a lot more. Once the glaze had all dried up and I was ready to start painting some details, I mixed up a deeper red for her lips. Again, like I said, the coverage on this paint is really nothing like any kind of model paints. If you think certain brands of model paints don't cover very well, then try using these craft paints for once, and then you might perhaps like every other paint that ever existed. For her eyebrows, I mixed up a little bit of a grey. It's not too dark, but it's not too light. It's definitely not white. This is going to be a base coat. I'm going to kind of pepper that onto her eyebrows. This will shape them, and I will slowly add a little bit of white over the top of that later on, just to try and bring out a little bit more depth, so they're not just completely grey, they have a bit more shape to them. On her eyes, I painted them black. The black paint went down pretty well. Because it's quite a thick paint, I was able to just fill the cavity of the eye, and this kind of filled it on one pass. I then took a bit of blue and mixed it into the white to make a kind of bluish icy white, and I painted the first layer of the inside of her eyes. I allowed this to dry, and I came back again later and I added a little bit more white towards the center just to create some depth out of it. I then added a little bit more yellow and a bit more white into my skin tones that I had previously made, and I went into the eye areas and I just kind of highlighted some of the areas around her eyes and also some of the areas around her ears, and especially on her chin as well. These are areas that I felt like the light would hit a little bit more, and because the light could be essentially any color you want it to be, most cases it's probably the sun, using a yellow is not going to be a problem to create the highlights. Just remember, adding yellow will create more saturation in your color. Adding white to your skin color will take away the saturation and desaturate it and make it look less lifelike. Once I had gone over a couple more details, like just touching up the lips and things, I then called the model done, and this is where I leave the video. Now I know that this may have been a little bit past certain people's knowledge and theory of color, but it isn't something too far to grasp. It's pretty straightforward, and if you do have any issues, the best thing you can do is look up a color chart and try to figure out what colors make what colors. The most important thing with something like this, especially if you can only find 3 colors, is to look for the purest form of those 3 primary colors that you are able to find. The yellow needs to be as yellow as possible, the red needs to be a pure red, and blue, well, we don't talk about blues because blues are always the worst one for colors that are added to them to make them look how they look. This will help you to mix them a little bit better and make sure that you aren't getting colors that you weren't expecting out of it. Now, of course, we are at the end of the video, and I do need to say a special thank you to the Patreons who support me and help keep these lights blinding my eyeballs. And speaking of the Patreons, I got a couple new Patreons this week which I would like to personally thank. Tadu Kotz and Andrew Ivans. Thank you dudes so much for your contribution to the channel and help keeping these lights blinding my eyeballs. The most important thing is it gets you away from Facebook, which is super toxic and not worth any of your time. And now we are at the part of the video that is my absolute favorite. This is the time where I get to tell all those people who didn't like anything they saw in this video, just click dislike, dude, and then f*** off. I'm getting pretty sick and tired of being told how I should do my own paintings, let alone my own videos. Thank you for coming. Now please f*** off.